Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Lincoln Riley, USC, going into what I think might be a must-win football game against Penn State this Saturday. Want to get into some of the problems that USC needs to clean up if they want to have a chance at winning that football game against a very good Penn State team. And for the USC fans who've been rocking with the boys for the last couple of weeks, you kind of know where it starts, and that is the offensive line. Now, we got on Sunday morning, recapped the USC Minnesota game. For lack of better terms, hammered the offensive line, just wasn't good enough. Now, I think the conversation is, how does USC go about addressing the offensive line heading into this football game against Penn State? Because if you see very similar play from what we've seen over the last couple of weeks, it's just not going to be good enough to beat Penn State. That being said, I do think there are some potential answers, or at least some things you can do to help this USC offensive line against Penn State. Want to get into that conversation. I also want to talk about the conversation between Miller Moss, Jada Maeva. I've seen that really heat up over the last couple of days, and I'll start out with this. I'm sure many of the USC fans who are listening to this also listen to the Trojan Blade, who I think, shout out, I think does a really good job talking USC ball. He knows his stuff, clearly watches the game at a high level. I'm going to kind of echo what he said, and that is, if Lincoln Riley's not a perfect head coach, I think that's very clear. There are things that we've been very critical of him about over the last couple of years. That being said, one thing I've never criticized from Lincoln Riley is what he can do at the quarterback position, not only in terms of developing quarterbacks, but also picking the right quarterback. I mean, you go back 12 months ago, or what, about 8 months ago, when you're kind of having the conversation of where's USC going to go at the quarterback position. Lincoln Riley was dead on. Like, yeah, he recruited Malachi Nelson out of high school, but knew that Malachi Nelson wasn't the answer. Malachi Nelson ends up transferring to Boise State. We kind of assumed he'd start. He's running with the twos. So in terms of picking the right quarterbacks, Lincoln Riley's track record, I think, is nearly perfect. He's obviously very good at developing the two. I don't think Jada Maeva really fixes some of the problems that you see with this USC offense. So I kind of get out, and we'll kind of dive back into that in just a little bit. Now, before we get into it, and as always to the USC fans, I'm going to say some things that might be hot takes. Some of y'all might not agree with. I would love to hear from you guys in the comment section. Again, many of y'all know I love talking this USC program. The amount of support y'all continue to show, it's amazing. So let it fly in the comment section. If you agree with me, disagree with me, if y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Again, the support means the world from the USC fans. And without further ado, let's get into this one. And I want to start with Jonah moving back to tackle. You look at the biggest problem with this USC offensive line, it starts at both tackle positions. And when you struggle on both edges with both offensive tackles, it becomes very hard to cover up an offensive line. Now, if you just have one tackle that might be struggling, you can line a tight end up and chip. You can use a running back to help in pass protection. But when you have both tackles that are really struggling, it suddenly becomes very hard to protect both those tackles. Now, the thing with Jones is, I get he's going to be an interior offensive lineman at the NFL. That's why he's kicked to that center position for 2024. That being said, both at the left tackle spot and right tackle spot, he's been elite for USC in the past. If you're USC, I just don't think you can trot out Mason Murphy and Elijah Page against NFL caliber edge rushers against Penn State and expect to win that football game. Now, if you put Jonah at tackle and you have one tackle that you really, really trust, and then you have one tackle that you might have question marks about, I think you can deal with that. I mean, you can line up a tight end over the edge rusher. You can chip the edge rusher. You can use a running back in pass protection. But when you have two tackles that you got question marks about, it suddenly becomes very hard to call an offense and try to cover that offensive line. So I think that's where it starts. And again, Jones is a proven commodity at tackle. He's been a very, very good tackle, both on the left and right side. And at the end of the day, with, I think, largely two tackles that are extremely they're struggling in a massive way with some of that elite competition in the Big Ten. And I wouldn't even call Minnesota elite, but you go back to that Michigan game, both Elijah Page and Mason Murphy and Tobias Raymond, when he came in, they struggled. And I think you're going to see a very similar story against Penn State on Saturday. If you can have one tackle that you trust, I think that matters massively in terms of what USC wants to do on offense. And that kind of gets into the second conversation where because you're struggling to the extent you are in pass protection, it's not really allowing USC to run their offense to the best of their ability. And you look at when USC is at its best, who are the best playmakers on this USC offense? Now you got Woody Marks in the running back room. We're going to talk about him in a little bit. But on the outside, it's Jacoby Lane and it's Deuce Robinson. What are those two wide receivers elite at? They're elite at pushing the ball down the field and making plays, attacking that deeper third. You go back to the film and you go back to the numbers with this USC offense playing Minnesota. This offense didn't complete a single pass 20 plus yards down the field. They only attempted two. And I think that largely comes down to this Lincoln Riley as a play caller right now, just not trusting this offensive line to hold up in pass protection long enough for these wide receivers to push the ball down, or for Miller Moss to push the ball down the field to some of these elite wide receivers. And so the struggle with pass protection, I get Miller Moss has taken some heat, and I understand where some USC fans are coming from where, hey, we need a quarterback that can extend plays a little bit more. I get that, but I'd rather fix the offensive line and rock with a quarterback that has shown he can be very good when protected than change to a quarterback that, yeah, might have a little bit of a higher ceiling from an athleticism standpoint, but there are still some massive question marks about Jade Maeva. What did we talk about when he transferred to USC? Yeah, he's a talented cat, and he might be a very good quarterback. But you go back to the 2023 film at UNLV1, it's a funky offense. It's much different from what USC wants to do, but I think more importantly, he's not nearly as consistent as a thrower that Miller Moss is. So you're asking me what the best solution is for this USC offense. To me, it's fix this offensive line, kick Jonah out to tackle, and try to fix the pass protection, as opposed to changing a quarterback and going to what I think is a unknown commodity within this USC offense. I think secondly, I think we got to lean on the run game more. And it's for a couple of different reasons. One, this USC offensive line running the football is actually pretty damn good. And we kind of said this heading into 2024, as much as Elijah Page and Mason Murphy have struggled in pass protection, this offensive line can run the football, and it can run the football at a high level. Now, this is something that clearly Lincoln Riley is a little bit uncomfortable with. Like, you look at the numbers from Lincoln Riley's offense, even going back to Oklahoma, they are a pass-heavy offense that wants to lean on the quarterback and wide receiver position. I get that. But I think part of being an elite football coach is looking at your roster, looking at your team, and leaning into what they do best. And I think for this USC team right now, this offensive line specifically, it's running the football. I mean, Woody Marks is playing phenomenal football. Quentin Joyner, I know he had the fumble, but Quentin Joyner's also running the rock extremely hard. And this offensive line is doing a really good job moving bodies off the line of scrimmage. And so I look at USC and say, all right, we have some problems in pass protection, but we can lean on the run game. And I think secondly, yeah, the points per game metric might be a little bit lower when you're running the football, but it's going to help out your defense. And you play a little bit more of a complementary game on the defensive side of the football. By far the biggest question mark for this USC defense right now, at least in my opinion, is depth. And we kind of saw that in the fourth quarter against Minnesota. I mean, you look at Nate Clifton, Gavin Mayer, they are playing a ton of football on the inside of that defensive line with a guy like Barry Alexander leaving. And so if you're USC, what's the best thing you can do to play complementary football and help your defense out? Stay on the football field, limit the amount of snaps that guys like Nate Clifton and Gavin Mayer can play. Nate Clifton and Gavin have been playing their absolute tails off on the inside of that defensive line, but you don't want to have them playing 60 snaps in a football game. It's very similar to my Michigan Wolverines, and something they're struggling with too is, hey, we got some good inside defensive linemen, but the depth ain't great. And so not only leaning on the run game, I think better fits right now what this USC offense can do. I think more importantly, it's going to help your defense, and you might not see the defense kind of wilt away like we've seen in a couple games this year in the fourth quarter. I think finally, and this kind of goes without saying, this team needs Eric Gentry back. I don't know what it is, but Eric Gentry's versatility, his playmaking ability, he's the best defender on this USC team, and quite frankly, he's arguably the best player on this USC football team right now. His absence against Minnesota was felt in a lot of different ways. One, the linebackers in Mason Cobb and Mascarenas Arnold, they just didn't play that good of football. They weren't getting off blocks. They weren't fitting the run all that well. You saw some missed tackles, but I think more importantly, this USC team really struggled to create any negative plays. I think he had 1 sack and only 3 tackles for loss in that football game. Getting opposing offenses off schedule, creating some of those negative plays is such a massive metric when you want to be an elite defense. And Eric Gentry's been the guy to do that for USC over the last couple of weeks. And not having Eric Gentry, that playmaker, that guy that can create the negative plays, certainly didn't it hurt this USC defense, and Minnesota was able to stay on schedule. That offense never felt like they were uncomfortable in that football game. And I think that's largely because a guy like Eric Gentry wasn't on the football field. There's nothing you can do besides just hope Eric Gentry can get back as soon as possible. That being said, I think that's another storyline from that football game. We're going to talk about a little later this week USC's pathway to a college football playoff appearance. And I know it's frustrating to talk about that coming off a loss against Minnesota, but I do think a pathway is still there. You look at LSU, uh, in the standings, in the SEC standings, they're the number one team. They're undefeated in the SEC. LSU having success in the SEC could be massive for USC. And I think more importantly, look at that SEC conference and say it's kind of just cannibalizing itself. I mean, you just saw absolute mayhem in the SEC on Saturday. That's going to open up a lot of doors for a lot of teams that maybe had some disappointing losses early to finish strong and potentially get themselves in that conversation. Now, that conversation is not worth having until USC fixes some of these problems, specifically on the offensive line. We'll see if they can do it again. You beat Penn State. I think you are one. This team gets their confidence back, but I think more importantly, you're putting yourself in a striking distance conversation of the college football playoffs, which is no doubt what the goal is for this USC team. We'll close it out there. We'll talk about this matchup a lot more over the next couple of days. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll talk to y'all later. Peace.